Kethver stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Union, vessel Serene Passage, and watched the human ships move through the darkness of space with a curiosity that bordered on amusement. He was a Volante, a member of a species that had evolved beyond violence over 10,000 years ago, and his people served as the galaxy's neutral chroniclers, recording the rise and fall of civilizations. Without ever taking sides, his forearms moved gracefully as he adjusted the recording devices that would capture every moment of humanity's first joint military exercise with the allied species of the Galactic Union. Humans were newcomers to the stars, having discovered faster-than-light travel barely 2 centuries ago, and most species viewed them as children stumbling into a universe they did not understand. Either shared this view and read the reports about Earth and its inhabitants. These strange bipedal creatures, who had spent most of their history fighting each other over patches of dirt and abstract ideas, they were emotional and unpredictable and surprisingly fragile. With lifespans so short that a Volante elder might outlive 10 generations of them, the exercise was meant to be simple, a demonstration of cooperation between species, a chance for the humans to prove they could follow orders and work within the established framework of Galactic Civilization. Captain Danny Morrison commanded the human contingent from aboard the Earth vessel Starbound HFY, had studied Morrison's file and found nothing remarkable about the man. He was 53 years old, with gray hair at his temples and a calm manner that suggested either great wisdom or profound emptiness. His second in command was a woman named Lisa Grant, younger and sharper, with eyes that seemed to notice everything and reveal nothing. The exercise proceeded smoothly for the first 6 hours. Human ships moved in formation with Corvati cruisers and Volante observers and a dozen other species, all performing the choreographed maneuvers that had been planned months in advance. Kethver was beginning to think his assignment would be boring then. The distress signals arrived. They came flooding in from the Vanthos system, a cluster of 3 colony worlds on the outer edge of civilized space, and the messages were filled with panic and terror, and a single repeating word that made even Kethver's ancient hearts beat faster: the Krethnak swarm had emerged from dark space. Kethver knew the swarm only from historical records because no living Volante had ever encountered them directly. They were biomechanical horrors, a species that existed only to consume, and they had devoured 17 spacefaring civilizations over the past million years. The reports said they moved like a living darkness across the stars, their ships grown from organic matter and armed with weapons that adapted to any defense. They did not negotiate or retreat or show mercy because they had never needed to understand such concepts. The swarm was supposed to remain dormant for another 50 years, according to the best predictions of the Galactic Council. The predictions were wrong. 3 colony worlds, with a combined population of 4 billion souls, now lay directly in the path of the awakening nightmare. The Allied commanders gathered via holographic conference to discuss strategy, and Kethver watched with the detachment. His species was known for Admiral Garthax of the Corvathi fleet spoke first, his massive frame filling the holographic display as he outlined the tactical situation. The swarm numbered over 800 vessels. The combined Allied fleet numbered less than 100. Mathematics were simple and brutal. There would be no victory. Only question was how many lives could be saved through strategic withdrawal and which populations would be sacrificed to buy time for the others. Acceptable losses would need to be calculated. Ether noticed that Captain Morrison did not participate in this discussion. The human stood silently at the edge of the conference, his face unreadable, while the other commanders debated which colony world should be abandoned first. When the calculations were complete, Admiral Garthax turned to Morrison with something like sympathy in his deep voice. "Captain, your vessels are the fastest here and could assist with evacuation of priority populations from Vanthos, prime before the swarm arrives." Morrison did not respond immediately. He seemed to be looking at something far away, something none of the others could see. "How long until the swarm reaches?" "The first colony," he asked quietly. 18 hours at current speed." Morrison nodded slowly and turned to Commander Grant. "Signal our fleet," he said, and his voice carried across the conference room with a weight that silenced every other conversation. "All ships break formation and set course for the Vanthos system at maximum speed." Kethfer was certain he had misheard. Ran a diagnostic on his translation implant and found no malfunction. Admiral Garthax leaned forward with confusion on his scarred face. "Captain, perhaps you misunderstand the situation. The swarm outnumbers us 40-1. There is no tactical scenario in which direct engagement results in anything other than total destruction of your fleet." "I understand the situation perfectly. Then what is your strategy?" Morrison turned to face the Karathi admiral directly, and something in his eyes made the massive warrior take an involuntary step backward. 4 billion people are about to die," Morrison said, and his voice was calm, but underneath that calm was something that Kethfer had never encountered in all his centuries of observing other species. "There is no strategy, there is just what we do. What you do is suicide. Maybe. But those people have 18 hours, and every minute we can buy them is another transport full of children that gets away. So we are going." Commander Grant was already relaying orders, her voice crisp and professional, as if they were not discussing a mission that would almost certainly kill them all. The other human ships responded immediately, breaking from the exercise formation and accelerating toward the Vanthos system without hesitation or complaint. Ether moved to intercept Morrison before he could leave the conference room. "Captain, I must understand. Your actions defy all logic. You cannot win this battle. You know you cannot win this battle. Why would you throw away the lives of your crew for strangers you have never met?" Morrison looked at him for a long moment, and Kethfer saw something ancient and terrible in those human eyes. Something that had been burning in this species since they first climbed down from the trees of their homeworld. "You want to know why?" Morrison said softly. "Because those strangers are someone's family. Because right now there are children on those colonies looking up at the sky and wondering if anyone is coming to help them. Because the universe is dark and cold and cruel. And sometimes the only thing you can do is stand between the darkness and the people it wants to take." He smiled then. A small sad smile that made him look both very old and very young at the same time. "We do not fight because we think we will win. We fight because some things are worth dying for. And if you cannot understand that, then I feel sorry for you." Morrison walked away, and Kethfer stood alone on the observation deck watching the human fleet shrink into the distant Set-23. Ships against 800, it was madness. It was suicide. It was the most beautiful thing Kethfer had ever seen. He returned to his recording equipment and began to document everything, knowing somehow that what he was about to witness would change the galaxy forever. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as humanity charged toward impossible odds. And somewhere deep in his ancient heart, Kethfer felt something he had not experienced in 1,000 years. He felt hope. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the Vanthos system and found the darkness. Waiting for them, Kethfer watched from the observation deck of the Serene Passage, which had followed at a safe distance to record the coming slaughter, and his 4 hands trembled against the console in a way they had not trembled in centuries. The Krethnak swarm filled the view screen like a living shadow spreading across the stars. 800 vessels moved in perfect coordination, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent light. their weapons already charging with the eager hunger of a predator that had never known defeat. Each ship was grown rather than built, a nightmare of teeth and tentacles and adaptive armor that could reshape itself to counter any attack. They did not communicate in any language the Galactic Union could understand. They simply consumed. Captain Danny Morrison stood on the bridge of the Starboard Hope and looked at the enemy before him with an expression that Keffer could not interpret. 23 human ships faced an armada that had destroyed 17 civilizations. The math said they would last perhaps 2 hours before being completely annihilated. Morrison turned to Commander Lisa Grant with a question that seemed absurd given the circumstances. How long until the first evacuation transports can launch from Vanthos Prime? Grant checked her display and answered without looking up. Colony authorities estimate 4 hours to load priority populations. Another 2 hours for secondary groups. Full evacuation requires at least 16 hours. Then we need to buy them 16 hours. No one on the bridge laughed at this statement. No one asked if the captain had lost his mind. They simply began preparing for battle as if buying 16 hours against 40-1 odds was just another problem to be solved. Kither opened a communication channel to the Starboard Hope because he needed to understand what he was seeing. Captain Morrison, your fleet cannot possibly survive 16 hours of combat against these numbers. You must know this. Morrison's voice came back calm and almost gentle. Probably not. But we can try, and trying is sometimes all you have. This is not logical. No, it is not. Logic would tell us to run. Logic would tell us to save ourselves and let those 4 billion people die. But we are not logical creatures. We are human. And humans do not abandon people just because saving them seems impossible. The channel closed, and Keffer watched as the human fleet accelerated toward the swarm in a formation that made no tactical sense to any military doctrine he had ever studied. They were not trying to survive. They were not trying to win. They were trying to delay, to buy minutes and hours with their blood and their ships and their lives. Lieutenant Kevin Park led the first squadron of interceptors toward the swarms forward elements. He was 24 years old with a wife on Earth who was expecting their first child, and he knew he would never see that child born. His squadron of 12 small fighters faced over 700 enemy vessels when Commander Grant asked for his status. His voice was steady and even cheerful in a way that made Kethfer's heart ache. Buying time, ma'am. Estimate we can hold their attention for about 12 minutes before they punch through us. Make them count. 12 minutes. He spoke about his own death, the way another being might speak about a minor inconvenience. The interceptors hit the swarm like sparks against a wall of darkness, their weapons blazing as they weaved through the nightmare fleet with a recklessness that bordered on insanity. Park's voice continued to relay tactical information, even as his squadron was torn apart around him. 3 down. 9 still fighting. Scratch that. 2 more gone. We're pulling them toward grid 7 if the destroyers want to hit them there. The human destroyers moved to take advantage of the opening Park's sacrifice was creating, and Kethfer watched as vessels captained by men and women who knew they were going to die fought with a fury that defied all reason. The destroyer Relentless took a direct hit that should have destroyed it completely, but somehow it kept firing, its captain Maria Santos refusing to acknowledge that her ship was dying around her. When the engines finally failed and the Relentless began to drift toward the swarm's main body, Santos made a decision that would haunt Keffer for the rest of his very long life. She aimed her crippled vessel at the largest concentration of enemy ships and overloaded a reactor core. The explosion took 37 swarm vessels with her. Her last transmission was a single phrase directed at the Starboard Hope. For the children, Kethver had seen battle before he had chronicled. Wars between species that lasted centuries, witnessed the fall of empires and the death of worlds. But he had never seen anything like this. Humans did not fight the way other species fought. They did not calculate odds or measure acceptable losses or retreat when the situation became hopeless. They fought as if death itself was just another enemy to be defied, another obstacle to be overcome through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. Lieutenant Park's squadron lasted 14 minutes, 2 more than he had estimated. His final transmission was a single word directed at Commander Grant. "Sorry," he apologized. For dying late, Kethver stared at his recording equipment and realized that his translation protocols were failing, not because of technical error, but because his language simply had no words for what he was witnessing. The Volanthi had evolved beyond violence 10,000 years ago, and in doing so, they had lost the ability to understand the terrible beauty of beings who would die for strangers too. Hours into the battle, the human fleet had lost 7 ships. The swarm had lost 94. It was not enough to matter, not against those numbers. But it was impossible. No species had ever inflicted such losses on the Krethmek swarm. No species had ever made them pay so dearly for every inch of space, they claimed. Captain Morrison directed the battle from the starboard hope with a calm that seemed almost inhuman, moving his remaining vessels like pieces on a chessboard, always seeking the next opportunity to trade lives for time. "First evacuation transports are launching," Commander Grant reported, and her voice cracked slightly with emotion she was trying to hide. 17 million people are on their way to safety." Morrison nodded once, his face pale but determined. "Then we keep going. Every minute matters. Every second matters." Kethver looked at the tactical display and did the math that Morrison refused. To note the current rate of attrition, the human fleet had perhaps 6 more hours before complete destruction. The evacuation needed at least 14 more hours. They could not win, they could not survive, but they kept fighting anyway. And somewhere in the depths of his ancient soul, Kethver began to understand something that would change him forever. He began to understand what it meant to be human. 8 hours had passed since the battle began, and the stalwart hope was dying. Kethver watched the human flagship list badly to one side as atmosphere vented from a dozen breaches in its hull, and he wondered how the vessel was still fighting at all. Captain Danny Morrison had been injured 3 hours ago when a bulkhead collapsed on the bridge, but he refused to leave his command chair, even his blood soaked through the bandages on his arm. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside him, her uniform torn and her face smeared with smoke and sweat, relaying orders to what remained of their fleet. 9 ships of the original 23 vessels that had charged into this impossible battle. Only 9 remained operational, and most of those were held together by desperate repairs and the stubborn refusal of their crews to admit defeat. The first colony world, Vanthos Prime, had completed its evacuation. 17 million souls had escaped aboard transport ships that were now racing towards safety. And every single one of those souls was alive, because humans had died to give them time. But 2 colony worlds remained. 41 million people on Vanthos 2 and Vanthos 3 were still loading onto transports, still looking up at the sky and praying that someone would hold the darkness back long enough for them to escape. Morrison studied the tactical display with eyes that had grown hollow from exhaustion and grief. Half his crew was dead. Friends he had served with for decades had been reduced to names on a casualty list, and more names were added every minute as the swarm continued its relentless advance. His remaining officers had begun to speak the words he did not want to hear. "Captain," said Lieutenant Commander Stephen Hayes, his voice heavy with reluctant practicality, "we have done more than anyone could ask. We have saved 17 million lives. If we withdraw now, we can save what remains of our fleet and live to fight another day." Morrison did not respond immediately, looked around the ruined bridge at the faces of the men and women who had followed him into hell. And he saw the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope that they might survive. This, after all, how many hours until Vanthos 2 completes evacuation? He asked. Quietly, Grant checked their console. 18 hours minimum. And Vanthos 3, 22 hours. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment. And when he opened them again, his face held something that made Hayes take a step backward. "Then we stay." "Captain, that is not possible. We cannot survive 18 hours. The mathematics simply do not allow it. The mathematics said we would all be dead 4 hours ago. And yet here we stand, deep in the ship." Medical Officer Carol Adams moved through corridors filled with wounded and dying crew members. Her hands stained with blood that would never fully wash away. She was 63 years old, and she had served on 7 different vessels throughout her long career. And she had never seen carnage like this. A young ensign named Peter Blake grabbed her sleeve as she passed his stretcher, his eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who knows they are probably going to die. "Doctor, are we going to make it?" Adams looked down at the boy, because that was what he was. Just a boy barely out of the academy with his whole life ahead of him. And she felt something crack inside her chest. She smiled anyway. "Not today," she said with a warmth that belied the chaos around them. "The captain has a plan." She did not know if Morrison had a plan. She suspected that his only plan was to keep fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. But the ensign needed hope more than he needed truth. And so she gave him hope, because that was sometimes all a doctor could offer. Chief Engineer Marcus Cole called from the engine room with news that was both terrible and wonderful. "Captain, I can give you 6 more hours of power if I stay behind to manually regulate the reactor core. The automated systems are shot to hell, but I can keep us running if I do it by hand." Morrison understood what Cole was offering. The reactor room would be flooded with lethal radiation within minutes of manual operation. Staying behind meant dying, slowly and painfully, cooked from the inside by the same energy that would keep the ship alive. "Marcus, I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking." "Captain, I am volunteering. I have grandchildren on Vanthos 3. Twin girls named after their grandmother. I am not going to let them die because I was too afraid to sit in a hot room for a few hours." There was silence on the communication channel for a long moment. "Tell them I fixed it," Cole said, and there was a smile in his voice that made Kethfer want to weep. "Tell them Grandpa fixed it so they could go home." Morrison's voice was rough when he finally responded. "I will tell them myself. I promise." The 9 remaining human ships formed a defensive sphere around the evacuation corridor, positioning themselves between the swarm and the fleeing transports like a wall of flesh and steel and determination. They had stopped trying to win the battle. They had stopped trying to survive. They were simply trying to buy minutes and hours with everything they had left, trading their lives for time, the way a merchant might trade gold for goods. Kethfer could not stay silent any longer. He opened a direct channel to Captain Morrison's personal communicator, ignoring every protocol that said he should remain a neutral observer. "Captain Morrison, I must understand what I am seeing. Your species baffles me in ways I cannot express. You are throwing away your lives for people you have never met, people who do not even know your names. Why would you do this?" Morrison's response came after a pause, and his voice was tired but patient. "You want to know why we fight? Look at the evacuation ships. Can you see them on your sensors?" Kethfer adjusted his display and found the convoy of transport vessels fleeing toward the outer system. "I see them. Look closer. Look at the viewports." Kethfer magnified the image until he could see the tiny figures pressed against the transparent windows of the transports. Their faces turned toward the battle raging behind them. Children, hundreds of thousands of children with their faces against the glass, watching the human ships die to protect them. That is why, Morrison said simply. That is always why some things matter more than survival. Some things matter more than logic or mathematics or acceptable losses. Those children matter. And we will burn ourselves to ash before we let the darkness take them. The channel closed, and Keffer sat alone with his recording equipment, watching the impossible happen before his eyes. The human fleet continued to fight, and the evacuation continued, and somewhere on the dying starward hope, an old engineer sat in a room that was slowly killing him and kept the lights, and so the children he would never meet might have a chance to live. This was humanity. This was what the stars would learn to furnish their weapons or their ships or their technology, but their terrible and beautiful capacity to love strangers enough to die for them. 14 hours into the battle, and Captain Danny Morrison was dead. The bridge of the Starward Hope had taken a direct hit 3 hours ago, and the man who had led 23 ships against 800 had died with his hands still gripping the arms of his command chair. Commander Lisa Grant had assumed command of what remained of the human fleet, which now consisted of 4 battered vessels that should have been destroyed a dozen times. Over she stood on the auxiliary bridge of the Starward Hope, a cramped room never designed for command operations, and directed the battle with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the first shot was fired. The second colony evacuation was complete. 41 million more lives had escaped to safety, bringing the total number of survivors to 58 million souls who would live because humans had refused to abandon them. But Vanthos 3 remained. 18 million people were still loading onto transports, still rushing through the corridors of their colony stations with whatever they could carry, still trusting that someone would hold back the darkness long enough for them to get awaketh. Vio had moved the serene passage closer to the battle. Despite the protests of his crew, he needed to see this, he needed to understand this, he needed to witness every moment of what was happening so that his chronicle would carry the full weight of human sacrifice. The Korvathi fleet had remained at the edge of the system throughout the battle, watching with the cold calculation for which their species was famous. They were warriors, proud and fierce, but they were also pragmatic beings who did not waste resources on lost causes. Admiral Garthax had observed the human fleet destroy itself against the swarm for 14 hours without offering any assistance. Now something was changing. Cather detected unusual activity aboard the Korvathi flagship. Communications traffic that suggested heated debate among their command staff. Then a channel opened, and Admiral Gonthax's acid form appeared on the display. His scarred face twisted into an expression that Kethver had never seen on a Korvathi before. Human Grant. The Admiral growled. Your species is completely insane. Commander Grant did not look up from her tactical display. Probably, she agreed without emotion. Your ships are broken. Your crew is dying. Your captain is dead. You cannot possibly win this battle. We know. Then why do you keep fighting? Grant finally looked at the Korvathi admiral, and her eyes held something that made the ancient warrior flinch. Because those 18 million people on Vanthos 3 are still alive, and as long as they are alive, we fight. That is what we do. That is what humans do. We fight until there is nothing left to fight with. Garthax stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Shemeterth realized, with astonishment, that the mighty Korvathi warrior was feeling ashamed. Here were beings with ships more advanced than anything humanity possessed, with crews trained for centuries in the arts of war, with weapons that could tear through swarm vessels like paper, and they had done nothing. They had watched from a safe distance as humans threw themselves into the fire. calculating acceptable losses and strategic positions while men and women died by the hundreds to protect. Stranger's Gorthax straightened to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire Kovathi fleet. All vessels, break formation and proceed to the human position at maximum speed. Arrival in 40 minutes. We go to war. Grant did not thank him. She did not have time for thanks. Try not to die before we get there, Gorthax added. And there was something like respect in his voice that had not been there before the channel closed. And Kethver felt his hearts pounding in a way they had not pounded in 1,000 years. He turned to his crew with words he never thought he would speak. Move the Serene Passage into the combat zone. We will provide medical support and evacuation, assistance for wounded human crews. His first officer stared at him with all four eyes wide in shock. Observer Kethver. Our species has maintained neutrality for 10 millennia. We do not participate in the conflicts of others. This is the foundation of everything we are. And for 10 millennia, we have watched others fight and die while we recorded their struggles from a safe distance. But I cannot watch this any longer. I cannot stand aside while these humans burn themselves to save strangers. If that makes me a poor Volanti, then so be it. The Serene Passage changed course, and Kethver opened a channel to the Galactic Union Observer Network. This is Kethver of the Volanthi Collective. I am breaking neutrality protocols to provide humanitarian assistance to human forces engaged in defense of the Vanthos system. I accept full responsibility for this decision. The response came faster than he expected. 3 other observer vessels announced they were following. His lead and 2 supply ships changed course, then a Telkari medical frigate that had been monitoring the battle from extreme range accelerated toward the combat zone. More ships followed. Species that had never cooperated began working together, moved by something they could not name, drawn toward the humans who were dying for people they had never met. Commander Grant watched her tactical display as the icons of allied vessels began appearing around the human fleet. And for the first time in 14 hours, she smiled. They are coming, she told her exhausted crew. All we have to do is hold until they get here. Ensign Tony Martinez laughed from his station, blood dripping from a head wound he had been ignoring for the past 3 hours. Just 40 more minutes. Easy. It was not easy. The swarm sensed the changing tide and pressed their attack with renewed fury. Desperate to destroy the human fleet before reinforcements could arrive, the stalwart Hope shuddered under impact after impact, and crew members died at their stations. And systems failed one after another, but they held. Lieutenant Amy Chun took command of the weapons systems when her superior officer was killed, and she kept the guns firing even as the deck plates buckled beneath her feet. Patty Officer Ryan Walsh sealed a hull breach with his own body, pressing himself against the gap while damage control teams worked to patch the hole. Medical Officer Carol Adams performed surgery in a corridor lit only by emergency lights, saving lives with hands that should have been too tired to move. 26 humans died in those 40-minute tests. 26 more names added to a list that already contained hundreds, but they held. And when the Kovathi fleet finally arrived, when the first massive warships of humanity's unlikely allies opened fire on the swarm, the 4 remaining human vessels were still fighting, still defiant, still refusing to surrender to the darkness. Admiral Gorthax looked at the tactical display showing the battered human fleet and felt something he had not felt since he was a young warrior facing his first battle. Humility. These fragile creatures, with their short lives and primitive ships, had done what no species in galactic history had ever managed. They had made the Krethmak swarm afraid, and they had done it not with superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but with something far more terrifying. They had done it with love. The combined fleet drove the swarm back across the Vanthos system in a battle that lasted another 11 brutal horse-corvati. Warships fought alongside human destroyers, their crews learning to coordinate through the chaos of combat. Their commanders finding a rhythm that neither species had. Expected Volanti medical vessels pulled wounded humans from drifting wreckage, saving lives that would have been lost without their intervention. The Telkari, the supply ships, the dozens of other vessels that had rushed to join the fight, all played their part in turning the tide. When the last swarm ship finally retreated into dark space, the third colony evacuation was complete. All 4 billion lives had been saved. Kether walked the corridors of the Starward Hope in the quiet hours after the battle, his 4 feet stepping carefully over debris and around the scorch marks left by fires that had been extinguished only through desperate effort. The ship was a tomb of the original crew of 400 men and women who had sailed into this fight. Only 63 had survived. The others lay in makeshift morgues throughout the vessel, their bodies covered with whatever sheets and blankets could be found, their faces peaceful in a way that seemed wrong given the violence of their death's commander. Lisa Grant stood on the ruined bridge, staring out through a viewport that had somehow survived the destruction around it. The stars beyond were the same stars that had witnessed humanity's charge into impossible odds. And Kether wondered if those distant lights understood what they had seen. Grant had not slept in 37 hours. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly whenever she let them rest. But she stood straight and proud in the way of someone who knew the job was not finished. "You will want to know," she said without turning around, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting commands over the noise of battle. "Your people always want to know why we fight, why we die, why we keep going when every rational calculation says we should stop." Kether moved to stand beside her, his recording devices already active, knowing that these words would become the heart of his chronicle. "I have asked myself that question many times over the past 2 days," he admitted. "I have no answer that satisfies." Grant smiled faintly, a tired expression that held both sorrow and something else, something warmer. "It is not courage," she said. "Courage runs out." There were moments in that battle when every person on this ship was terrified beyond reason, when our hands shook and our hearts screamed at us to run. Courage alone would never have kept us here. Then what? It is not training either. Training tells you when to retreat. Training gives you the calculations that say a fight is lost and fighting on is foolish. Training would have sent us running hours before the reinforcements arrived. She turned to face him, and Kether saw something in her eyes that he recognized now, something that had been burning in Captain Morrison's eyes before he died, something that seemed to live in every human he had encountered since this ordeal began. It is not even duty. Though we dress it up that way, duty is an obligation, something you fulfill because you must. What we did here was not obligation. Then what is it? What drives your species to throw yourselves into fire for strangers? You will never know. Grant reached out and touched the viewport, her fingers pressing against the cold, transparent material, as if she could touch the stars beyond. "It is love," she said simply. "That is it. That is the whole answer. We love too much." Kether did not understand. Love is a feeling between individuals, between families and friends and communities. How can you love people you have never met? "That is what makes us human," Grant replied. "We love people we have never met. We love futures we will never see. We love the idea that somewhere a child we will never know might grow up safe because we stood here and refused to move." She gestured at the ruins around them, at the blood-stained deck and the shattered consoles and the places where her friends had died. This ship, these people, they gave their lives for strangers. Not because they were ordered to, not because they thought they would win, but because they could not stand to do nothing while innocent people died. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Marcus. Cole sat in a reactor room that was cooking him alive because his granddaughters were on Vantos 3. He never met most of the 18 million people he saved, but he loved them anyway. He loved them enough to die for them. That is humanity. That is what you saw. Kepher returned to the Serene Passage and began composing the chronicle that would be presented to the Galactic Council. It would reshape how the universe saw humanity forever. He began with a simple statement. I came to document humanity's first joint military exercise, a routine assignment that I expected would yield nothing of importance. Instead, I witnessed the birth of a legend. I witnessed 23 ships charge into battle against 800. I witnessed men and women die with smiles on their faces because they knew their deaths would buy time for strangers to escape. I witnessed the impossible happen over and over again until it stopped being impossible and became simply what humans do. He continued, I understand now why the stars will learn to fear them. It is not their weapons, for their weapons are crude compared to ours. It is not their ships, for their ships are fragile things that break too easily. It is not even their willingness to die, for many species will die when cornered. It is that they will die for anyone, anywhere, for any cause they believe is just. They will charge into darkness and drag you into the light, whether you ask for it or not. They will love you fiercely and protect you violently, and never once ask for thanks. He wrote about the Krethnak swarm, the species that had consumed 17 civilizations, the species that understood hunger and power and the cold mathematics of survival. They do not understand love. Kepher concluded, this is why they will lose. This is why against the impossible fury of human devotion, they will always lose. You cannot defeat an enemy who is willing to die for you. You cannot consume a species that considers death a reasonable price for protecting strangers. Commander Lisa Grant was promoted to captain in the months that followed. She named her new vessel the Morrison after the man who had led them into the fire. And she served with distinction for another 40 years before retiring to a colony world in the outer systems. The Starboard Hope was rebuilt and served for another century, its corridors haunted by the memories of those who had died aboard her, its legacy carried forward by each new crew that walked her decks. The Korvathi became humanity's closest allies, their warrior culture finding common ground with beings who fought for love rather than glory. Admiral Gorthax visited Earth before he died and stood at the memorial wall that listed the names of everyone who had fallen at Vantos, and he wept in a way that Kovati were never supposed to weep. The Volanti abandoned their neutrality permanent, became the first of his species to take up arms in defense of another. And when he was asked why he broke 10,000 years of tradition, he said simply that the humans had taught him something worth learning. And across the galaxy, in the quiet moments between stars, species that had once dismissed humanity as primitive newcomers began to tell their children a different story. Be good to humans, they would say. They are small and fragile, and their lives are painfully short, but they love with the fury of dying stars, and they will burn themselves to ash to keep that love alive. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the oldest or the wisest or the most advanced, but they are the most dangerous. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they will never stop trying to save you, even from yourself. And that, the story always concluded, is why the darkness fears them. On a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, children played in gardens that their grandparents had planted, never knowing that somewhere among the stars, beings who had never seen Earth spoke their species' name with something between fear and reverence. The humans continued to love too much. They continued to fight for strangers. They continued to throw themselves into fire because they could not bear to watch the innocent burn in the galaxy slowly. Learned what Captain Danny Morrison had known from the very Beginning. Some things matter more than survival. Some things are worth dying for, and sometimes the smallest spark of love is enough to hold back the endless dark.